7 months ago, the Minnesota Timberwolves were in the Western Conference Finals, enjoying their best season in 20 years, with a real chance to win the NBA title. They had size, skill, defense, and a fantastic young guard at the center of it, in Anthony Edwards. And now their team is falling apart. We know what happened in between then and now. They traded away their second best player, who is now thriving on his new team, for financial flexibility and a draft pick. And the team that trade left behind is completely lost. And as I said, at the center of it is the most important player in franchise history, not named Kevin Garnett. Anthony Edwards was, in a large part, the reason the Timberwolves traded away Karl Anthony Towns. They wanted more flexibility for the future. They wanted to be able to build a sustainable contender around him, and despite the success of last season, they felt trading Cat was a better way for them to do that. The problem is, in the meantime, Anthony Edwards is clearly unhappy with the situation in Minnesota. Now, this isn't exactly worst case scenario for Minnesota because Anthony Edwards is under contract through 2029. If you clicked on this video thinking that Anthony Edwards was going to request a trade or the Timberwolves were going to have to trade him anytime soon, that does not seem likely at all. He's 24 years old. He's on his first extension after his rookie contract. Minnesota has him sign long term, which is probably one of the reasons why they felt comfortable making the Cat trade in the first place. But that doesn't change the fact that they have to figure this out. It is so unbelievably taxing mentally on a star player to think that they were rising to the top. They were having their moment. They were making the conference finals. And yes, they lost in 5 games, but the first 3 games of that series were unbelievably close. They lost by like 3, 2, and 9 points in the first 3 games of that series. Minnesota could have been in the NBA Finals 7 months ago. And now Anthony Edwards is on this kind of middling Western Conference team, and that takes a huge toll on a player that thinks they're ascending to one of the best players in the league. And Ant has said it himself. He said it out loud. He said, I don't want to be this facilitator guy at this point in my career. I'm the focal point of all this. I want to score. And the game after he said that, he went out and scored 50-something points, and they still lost by double digits to Detroit, who was on the second half of back-to-back, and of course is missing some guys like Jaden Ivey. So even though this isn't your typical, oh my gosh, Anthony Edwards is going to ask out, Minnesota's going to lose their star kind of situation, it's so difficult to purposefully and intentionally go from the Western Conference Finals to just not very good at all. And I don't think that was the intention for Minnesota. The point of the deal was, yes, to create financial flexibility, to have the future first-round pick, to add someone in Donte DiVincenzo that they felt like was a good fit on their team, and then probably let Randall walk, get out of the cap money, and then move forward from there. But I'm pretty sure they thought the team was going to be basically as good as last year's team. They could replace Cat with Randall and DiVincenzo, have the pick, have the flexibility, and not have exactly what has happened this season. And in hindsight, that was pretty silly because Randall's fit, even in New York, wasn't all that great because he wants the ball a ton. He doesn't space the floor super well off the ball. He dribbles the air out of the ball a lot of times. And although Donte DiVincenzo had a great season last year, it was really his only truly great NBA season. And then they immediately took him out of that situation and put him on the Timberwolves. And in the long term, you could argue that this would still be the right move for Minnesota to create that flexibility because there are a lot of people, I'm not one of them, but there are a lot of people that think that Minnesota wasn't actually that good that last year, where they weren't actually that close to making the finals or winning the title, and that Dallas series was never even close, and that Rudy Gobert causes all these issues for them in the postseason, and then it made sense to make that trade. But whether you believe that or not, it's clear that this has been a disaster scenario for Minnesota. And one of the arguments that you're going to hear a lot is that the reason this has happened is not Minnesota's fault. It's the new CBA. It's the second apron. It's this new agreement that the league put into place that limits roster flexibility. That's not really the case. Yes, the CBA makes it more difficult to have a gigantically expensive roster than teams have had the prior few years. That's why they put it in the first place, so that owners could save money, so that in theory you would spread the talent out around the league a little bit more. But there are teams around the league, like Boston, that have no issue having wildly expensive rosters. They're okay having Drew Holiday, Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, Kristaps Porzingis, and other guys on giant contracts, having the most expensive team in the league. There's nothing in the CBA that says that you have to trade away Karl Anthony Towns for less than his value so that you can be under some imaginary number threshold. They could have kept all their guys. It was possible. This is what the CBA did to Minnesota. When the second apron thing becomes real for a team like the Timberwolves, which it was, you have Gobert, McDaniels, Anthony Edwards, and Karl Anthony Towns. They were going to have a Celtics-esque payroll over the next couple of years had they kept Towns and not made the trade. What the CBA does in that scenario is that is your team. The team that you have, the team that Boston has now, the team that Minnesota would have had they kept Cat, that's your team for the next 3 to 4 years. If you want to contend, if you want to try and win a title, you're not going to be able to randomly add another star at the deadline. You're not going to even be able to add someone like Kyle Kuzma at the deadline. It is so restrictive in terms of what kind of trades you can make, what kind of money you can take back, what you can do to maybe dump Rudy Gobert or Karl Anthony Towns on into the future. It gets so restrictive. And you don't have a choice. You cannot really change your roster once you've locked that in. And that was the turning point. That was the point of no return this past offseason was for Minnesota. And that was what the CBA did to them. They made the choice that the roster they had, that they had just made the Western Conference Finals with, that Anthony Edwards liked playing and having the spacing of Karl Anthony Towns, having the defense of Rudy Gobert, all that stuff that was in place, they decided that team wasn't good enough to compete for titles for the next couple of years to justify the expense of the team as well as the limited roster flexibility. That's what the CBA did. And whether you think that's the case or not, whether Minnesota could have kept their team together and competed, I certainly think that they could have. They were at times the best defensive team that we've seen in a very long time in the playoffs last year. There was a point in the postseason last year where it looked like they were the favorites in the Western Conference. And sometimes the playoffs do come down to matchups, and they weren't a very good matchup against Dallas. And whether you believe they were true long-term contenders or not is irrelevant. What is relevant is the situation that Minnesota now finds himself in and the situation that they chose to put themselves in. They made that choice knowing that this season, how it's gone, was a real possibility, and they could risk alienating Anthony Edwards. Not necessarily in the sense of he's going to get traded this year, he's going to get traded next year, but look at the Jimmy Butler situation. Now, obviously, Jimmy Butler's temperament is what it is, but one of the reasons why he's upset in Miami is obviously the long-term contract situation, but he thought they were going to get Bradley Beal, he thought they were going to get Damian Lillard. At some point, he thought he was going to get a little bit more help, another star, someone that he could play alongside and kind of take some of the scoring burden and just be really good. He didn't think Tyler Hero was still going to be on the team. He might not have thought Bam Adebayo was still going to be on the team. He's thought for years that they were going to add another star, and eventually it just became too much along with some other factors. What if that's what's happening with Anthony Edwards right now? What if right now in 2025, in 2027, 2 years from now, he looks back and says, you know what? I'm out. I don't want to be here anymore. I have a contract for the next couple of years, but I don't want to be here. Please trade me. You guys have not given me enough help. I'm trying to score 50 against Detroit just to keep us competitive. Mike Conley got old. Julius Randle didn't do anything, left for nothing. Dante DiVincenzo can't make a shot. We got nothing for this first round pick. We traded up for Rob Dillingham. That's done nothing. I'm tired of playing with Gobert. He's just over it. He wants a more competitive team. That is a situation that is distinctly possible as a direct result of the Karl Anthony Towns trade. And whether that turns out to be the right decision in the long term or not, it was unbelievably risky to make that choice at the time. Now, you can certainly blame Minnesota for the Cat trade if you'd like to. Maybe this is the beginning of the end of the Anthony Edwards era in Minnesota, and the Cat trade is kind of the starting point of that for you. But for me, this goes back to how they built the roster in the first place. Giving up all the stuff that they did in exchange for Rudy Gobert, which, yes, obviously helped their defense, and him alongside Towns was one of the reasons that they made the conference finals, but also that was also one of the reasons they had to trade Cat in the first place. If they never traded for Gobert, who's also making a ton of money, they would have been able to keep Cat. McDaniel still develops, and they've got a roster spot there that they can use some of that money on. Without Gobert there, there's no telling how good the team would have been defensively without Gobert, but that, I think, really is the point that I would look at and say, that's where they screwed it up. Yes, trading away Karl Anthony Towns is the most direct link to how this season has gone, but if they never make the Gobert trade and just let Cat and Ant and McDaniels develop together, that is probably the better option. And then when the second apron comes around, maybe they weren't anticipating the CBA at the time, but the second apron comes around and you have the financial flexibility that the Karl Anthony Towns trade provided you, while also still having Karl Anthony Towns on the team. And the bottom line for me is, everything that Minnesota does moving forward has to revolve around how can we keep Anthony Edwards happy? How can we continue to have this guy on our team? He is one of the rising young stars in the entire league. He's everything to the franchise. If he leaves, if he requests a trade, it's like Giannis in Milwaukee. Like, you're not getting that guy again. You've lost this one dynamic piece that you had that could possibly lead you to a title. And I think that's why they made the Karl Anthony Towns decision, is they felt like that was the best thing they could do to try and keep Ant long term. That hasn't happened so far, and if they keep putting this much of a burden on him, if he keeps getting this frustrated, things could go pretty badly pretty quickly.